understanding as a class, that we might see the things you have for us and even find application in it. We thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're continuing through Ecclesiastes. So last week we looked at the first 14 verses of chapter 7, and it was full of stuff. So we saw that a good name was compared to perfume, and we talked about what perfume is like, how it affects people, and how a good name is supposed to have the same effect, and often does. We talked about being in a house of mourning is more beneficial than being in a house of partying, because as it says in Ecclesiastes, mourning is going to be a part of every life. Therefore, you gain greater understanding through mourning than you do through partying, so to speak. We talked about rebuke being better than songs. We talked about how oppression can affect a wise man either as a perpetrator or a victim, whether the wise man chooses to oppress others or to be a victim of this oppression. We also talked about bribes, perseverance, patience. Man, we talked about a lot. Self-reflection, prosperity, adversity, and last of all, we talked about God's sovereignty, which we're going to head on again today as well. So those verses, the first 14 verses, kind of give a description of what a life of wisdom looks like. From verses 15 to 29, we actually kind of get a suggestion. It's more like a suggestion of how to be wise. So we're switching more from a descriptive type of thing, a prescriptive kind of thing, as far as how Solomon's suggesting to us that we would live a wise life. So as always, let's go ahead and read through the first, from verse 15 to 22. And why don't we start in the back with Bill, if we would. We'll just work our way up that way, just to start from a different angle. Or to Dan or Aaron. Verse 17, you're right on it. Sam, verse 20, if you got it there. Chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes. Leave verse 24 there. Let's see, we're Bill, verse 28. All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate that. So we're going to be looking at the first few verses, verses 15 to 22. You'll see the title of our class is called Advice for a Wiser Life, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. And the first part is kind of a comparison between righteousness and wickedness. And the first thing we see in verse 15, Solomon says, I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. So you've heard the people who said, I've seen it all, I've seen everything. And then sometimes you'll say, oh, now I've seen everything because something else has happened. You go, whoa, nothing can exceed this. Well, Solomon's talking. He says, I've seen it all. I've seen everything. And the whole purpose of Ecclesiastes is to try to find meaning to the life lived under the sun. The word under the sun meaning like in this life in general, from the human perspective. Well, I've seen it all. He says, two things are senseless to me. The very first thing he talks about in verse 15. He says, one thing that's senseless is a righteous man with a short life. So there's a righteous man with a short life that Solomon is saying that doesn't make sense to me. Now, there are many examples of people that I felt their lives were cut short. And if it was up to me, I would have granted them a long life because of their usefulness to the Lord. Most of us have heard of Eric Liddell. How many folks have seen the movie Chariots of Fire? It's an old movie, right? Most of us have seen it. And it's about Eric Liddell, who was called the Flying Scotsman because he was an incredible runner. He was something else. And he won the gold medal at one of the Olympics. And right after he was done with that, he went to China as a missionary. Now, he got to China, and I believe, and of course, most of it by Japan during the Second World War. And wound up in an internment camp, which is basically a prison camp for civilians. And he stayed there during the course of the war. It's that when he got toward the end of the war, in 1945, which is just 6 months before the war ended, he died of a brain tumor. Now, if it was up to me, I'd had Eric live at least 20 more years, right? And continue his ministry and that kind of thing. But that's because that's my perspective. It just seems like the life was cut too short. I'm going to flip over to Isaiah 40 just for a moment and kind of read something else kind of pertaining to this. Isaiah 40 and verse 13, which again starts to deal with that sovereignty thing again that we keep coming back to. Isaiah 40 and 13 says, "Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has informed him? With whom does he consult, and who gave him understanding? And who taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and informed him of the way of understanding?" And the answer, of course, is no one. It's rhetorical. I can't remember the last time the Lord came to me for advice. He doesn't need my advice. But from the human perspective, we see things like Eric Liddell or somebody like that. You go, well, Lord, he could have done a lot more. Well, Lord's purposes far exceed whatever purposes I would have in that situation. The other thing that Solomon sees as senseless, he says, the righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and the flip side of that is the wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. I mean, how many of us have seen wicked people and say, I would have cut that life off 20 years ago if it was up to me, right? Or some people were still waiting for justice to come to them. And we may have to wait till they stand before God. I mean, we don't have any control over that. But what is it about these wicked people who give so much grief? Now, this is also the question that people ask Christians a lot too, non-believers. Why is there so much evil in the world? Why are there evil people in the world? How can that be? And they think that obviously seals the deal that God is not a God of goodness and grace because there's evil people in the world and they get to do their evil stuff. So they think that's it. But why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there? My answer, go look in the mirror. That's why. Because we're sinful. And it's always a matter of degrees. I'm not a murderer, but I bet I could be. I've not committed certain sins, but I'm sure that I could. It's a matter of degree that God has kept me from certain things. The person in the mirror is the problem. I want you to turn over with me to Psalm chapter 73. Psalm 33, or 73, I'm sorry. I think we had a message on this, or we had a class on this. This is by Asaph. Now, Asaph was a choir director for David. So he was quite prominent. And surprisingly, 3,000 years ago or so, Asaph had the same kind of issues to think about. In Psalm 73, verse 1, "Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. So he starts off with that. But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My steps had almost tripped, for I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pains in their death, and their body is fat. They are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind. So here it's Asaph. He's kind of like Solomon. He's looking around and he's seeing these people who are obviously wicked, and yet they seem to have kind of a more carefree life. They don't have the problems that Asaph is perhaps facing because of being righteous. And God, that's just not fair, in essence, is what he's saying. But the chapter continues and goes down to verse 16. It says, when I pondered to understand this, so he did, he wrestled with it, he thought about it. It was troublesome in my sight until I came into the sanctuary of God. Then I perceived their end. Surely you have set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terrors. Like a dream when one awakes, O Lord, when aroused, you will despise their form. So Asaph, by coming back into the tabernacle, which, by the way, Solomon just built, he would have come into that magnificent building. And when he came into there, or into the courtyard, he said, now I get it. It isn't the way it seems after all. Randy Alcorn is an author from Oregon, and he's wrote several books. He's a great author. One of the books that he wrote is entitled, If God is Good. Has anyone heard of that book or read it? The whole book is designed to deal with the question, if God is good, hence the title, then why is there bad stuff? So some of the things he talks about, he says, how do you know God doesn't do something about these things? Well, how do you know God isn't doing something about it? You know? How many tragic events don't happen because God says no? We'll never know. It's kind of like I mentioned before in the fire service, fire prevention. Fire prevention doesn't get much credit because what do? They prevent fires. Well, how many fires do they prevent? Who knows, right? But if they weren't there, there would be a lot more, believe me. Same thing here. How many things does God really prevent? And how do you know God isn't doing something about it? We take a look at tragic events in history, and usually you see them coming to an end, but not as quickly as we would like, of course, in our short vision, as it were. It just doesn't work out the way that we think it should. Now, we'll see things differently when we get into heaven. We'll see why Eric Liddell died in 1945 and not in 1965. We'll see why Adolf Hitler didn't die in 1944 when that bomb went off in the Wolf's Lair. We'll see why that, but for now, it's mysterious, it's murky. But God is definitely involved in the events of mankind. But it can be a little bit hard for us to see from a human perspective, as it were. Verse 16, now this gets a little bit strange. Do not be excessively righteous, and do not be overly wise. Why should you ruin yourself? So we're going to see the next couple of verses, the application is moderation. He is prescribing moderation to his readers. Now again, reminder, Solomon wrote this from the perspective of whom again? Natural man, under the sun. So keep that in mind, okay? So he's applying moderation. He says, do not be overly righteous or wise. What in the world does that mean? If anything, I would think God would say, please be overly righteous and wise, by all means. But here's Solomon. Now I know it's from a world's perspective, but why would he say that? It seems to me like that's the goal, isn't it? Mark. Okay. If you know everything, you're not willing to listen or learn. Okay. Peggy? Pride? Okay. Pride? Other ideas? Don't be a Pharisee. Hold on to that thought. Somebody else? Somebody else have their hand up? Sarah? I see your hand, Sarah. I'm just not sure. There you go. Okay, Jen? Okay. there's a thought. Dave. Okay. Okay. So go ahead, Bill. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, good. Yes, Steve. Hmm. Yes. So let's get back to the Pharisees. Oh, go ahead, Eric. Yeah, exactly. Good. So the question I was going to bring up is, how do you know? How do you know when you're righteous enough? How do you know when you're wise enough? How do you know? Right? Well, the problem is, if you think you are, you're not. If you think you're righteous, you're not righteous. If you think you're wise, sorry to say this, you're probably not wise. Right? It's just the way it is. Julie? It does. That's true. That's true. Good. Good. Any other thoughts? Lou? Right. I agree. You know, you become Pharisaical, and that's why I appreciate that you brought that up. I didn't have to bring it up. You know, a Pharisee is somebody who looks down on everybody else because, frankly, well, you're just not as good as that guy is, right? How can it ruin us? We're kind of touching on how it can ruin us. It makes us think that we're something that we're not. If you think you're righteous, you automatically aren't because you have pride. If you think you're wise, you probably aren't because we just rarely are what we seem to be or think we are. Hold your place and turn to Luke chapter 18 just for a second. Good old Pharisees. They make great piñatas, don't they? So we have Luke chapter 18 and verse 9. Here's Jesus giving a parable, one of my favorite parables too. And Jesus also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. That's what we're talking about here, right? I mean, I'm righteous and most other people are contemptuous. That's what we're saying. Two men went up into a temple to pray, the temple. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. You can't get more diametrically opposed than these two people. Okay? The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. Now, I'm guessing that he's praying this out loud because that's usually the way they would do it. Now, what are these things probably true about this person? They probably are. He probably isn't a swindler. He probably doesn't take part in these sins. He's not unjust. He's not an adulterer. He fasts twice a week. In other words, I've mentioned before, he says, God, you're lucky to have me on your team. Right? Verse 13, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but he was beating himself on the chest and saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. And Jesus goes on to say which one was justified. It wasn't the Pharisee. He went his home feeling just the same way he came. But the tax collector confessed his sins. He got forgiven. And he had a righteous standing before God, whereas the Pharisee thought he did, and he didn't. This is one of the many ways it can ruin us. In verse 17 it talks about It says, do not be excessively wicked, and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? Now, this is a little more self-explanatory, right? You take someone who lives a very wicked life. It's not unusual. It doesn't always happen. But it's not unusual that something bad happens to that person, like Asaph mentioned. They're on slippery slopes, things happen, and he winds up, something bad happens. Patient in the fire service was dealing with people who had made bad choices and wound up paying the price for them. I know much of Scott's does too, as a police officer. One situation, we had a call one time to a Chevron station just down the street from our fire station. We got there and there was a gentleman on the ground, blood everywhere. We commenced with CPR, but he was, we call it DRT, he was dead right there. He had 40 to 50 gunshot wounds. So what happened was we had a gang war going on around our fire station, and he had been ambushed by a rival gang and shot 50 times. And they were very vicious about it. They started shooting him in the legs and worked their way up until they got the coup de grace to the head. I'm sure before he stopped at the gas station, life was great for him. He's probably about 18 or 19 years old. It really affected me quite a bit afterwards, because I thought, this guy was 18 or 19 years old, and what potential did he have? What could he have done in life if he'd known the Lord, if he hadn't made these choices? But because of these choices, all of a sudden he turns and there's two guys holding guns at him. Completely unexpected. What goes through your mind at that very moment? Don't be overly wicked, or this might happen. Now, there is an interesting, how could I say, not controversy, but discussion about verse 18, verse 18. So listen to it as I read it. It is good for you to grasp one thing and also not let go of the other, for the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. Now, looking back at verses 15, 16, and 17, what is the both? What does that mean? Julie? Okay. Okay, so living a righteous life and yet not crossing over to being judgmental. Right. Right. Okay. Okay. That's good. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? What's the both? Doesn't that sound kind of odd? Doesn't it seem like, Solomon would say, by all means, cling to righteousness and wisdom, forsake the other. Jen? Okay. Yeah, so what's the both? Okay. That's kind of my interpretation too, but go ahead, Peggy. Say it again. Okay, the distinction between the two. Okay. Jen. Yeah. Right. Good, good. Any other thoughts? It's good to provoke some discussion about that, because sometimes you'll read something and you just kind of breeze over it, and all of a sudden you come back and go, wait, whoa. So almost always in Ecclesiastes, there's been one or two things I've sitting there really grinding on during the week, and this is the thing I was grinding on during this week, because I'm going, the both, what is it? And I have 7 commentaries I consult when I'm studying these things, and only one of them actually dealt with it. All the rest just kind of scooted over. I thought, come on, you cowards. I got to teach a class. Give me some information here. Now, one commentator, Warren Wiersbe, I'm going to quote him in interpretation number 1 because he's such a learned person. He thinks that it refers to the righteousness and wisdom in verse 16. He thinks that do not forsake them both, righteousness or wisdom. And his reasoning is because it talks about wisdom and righteousness in verses 19 and 20. So that's good interpretation, and it may be the case. But for myself, interpretation number 2 is that both refers to the two big sections. The one section is righteousness and wisdom, and the other section is wickedness and foolishness. And that's how I read it, and it makes the most sense to me. But, well, it does and it doesn't, right? That's what I think is correct. So, again, keeping in mind, under the sun, we've kind of been hinting on what that looks like. Does God really want us to be moderately righteous and moderately wicked? Is that what God wants for us? Julie, you're so shy today. Go ahead. No. Okay, that's definitive. I mean, it almost seems like that, right? But no, of course he doesn't want us to be wicked or even moderate. He wants us to be greatly righteous. One of the commentaries I have is written by a man named Tommy Nelson. He's a pastor from Texas. I forget the name of the town. But anyway, he's been there for 40 years. He's written a couple books, and this one is called A Life Well Lived by Ecclesiastes. He says he knew a guy who said that he was a Christian but was actually a very ungodly man. When he approached this man quoted these verses as his life verse. You know, don't be excessively righteous, don't be excessively wicked. Just a little each. He said he knew it in 8 translations. So, hell mediocrity, right? So this was his life verse. So, what might God be referring to here through Solomon? Because I think there is an application here. What might he be referring to? Any thoughts? Kind of had it hinted a little bit. Jen? Okay. Okay. Righteous judgment by itself doesn't bring hope. Craig. Aha. I think that's getting pretty close to it. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit more. I would say one of the things I think about as I was going over this and over is God doesn't want us to focus on righteousness and wisdom as an end of itself, right? I mean, I do want to be righteous, and I do want to be wise, but I'm not really to focus on those things to be righteous and wise by themselves. What am I to be focusing on? Eric, say again? Application? Don't be a stumbling block. Okay. Julie? Okay. Superiority. Mark? Doing it to the glory of the Lord. Exactly right. Is that what you're talking about, Peggy, or something else? Yes. Exactly. Yes. So there again, it's not to be an end, but my end is to be serving the Lord, to learning about the Lord, to serving and to doing things for the Lord. It so happens as I do that, as I focus on Him, my righteousness will increase, even if I don't feel that it is. My wisdom will increase because I'm getting wisdom from God's Word, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where it all begins. So I don't focus on, I want to be righteous and wise, although I'd like to be. but I keep focusing on the Lord, and He adds these things to me, as it were. At the same time, I'm not to hold on to wickedness and foolishness in the sense that I want to practice them, but I will remember, as was mentioned here, I'm never going to be fully righteous. Even though my intent and desire is to live for the Lord 100% and to be wise, I'm going to trip and I'm going to fall because I got this wretched body, sin-filled body that I'm walking in. So one of the questions I posed to Jose today after worship team practice, or actually in the middle, and it's one thing I always have ongoing in my head, and it's one of the things I'm going to ask the Lord about when I get to heaven, unless it's obvious when I get there. And I think I've said this before. Lord, why didn't you make it so that when I received you, I suddenly had my sin nature gone? Now, would that not have been nice? Now, here's a question, and I don't have an answer because, like I said, I'm going to ask the Lord. I'm going to throw it out there because I want to see what you folks think. Why? Wouldn't it have been nice, Bill? Wouldn't it have been nice? You know, I mean, Mark, no more sin. Sarah goes, yes, no more sin. You know, Eric. Do away with your free will? I'm not sure I agree with that, because in heaven we'll be righteous and we'll still have a free will. Uh-oh. Now, Levi, if you got the answer, I'm going to feel really bad. I'm just teasing. Go ahead. Okay. Okay, I have a past life. It's a reminder. Okay. And go ahead, Jenna. Relying on God. So, well, in heaven we'll rely on God, even though we're going to be righteous, right? Yeah? I know I'm being a stinker, right? Bill. Okay. Okay. A relationship with the Holy Spirit that we wouldn't have to have necessarily. Somebody else? Okay. Okay. Back there, Steve. Sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you know, I'm not second guessing God like, you know, he made a mistake or something, but that's just one of these curious things. And you know, I appreciate everybody's. Mindy, go ahead. Oh, Mindy. There you go again. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good. Bill. Right. Yes. Excellent. I appreciate everybody's, like I said, I don't know the answer completely. One thing that somebody brought up either today or another day was, maybe if I became perfect in my Christianity, when, maybe I would no longer be able to relate to people who are living in sin. And maybe I would seem to them otherworldly like Jesus seemed. I mean, let's face it, Jesus was the perfect person, and he didn't have necessarily an easy time with non-Christians, right? So perhaps if I was perfect, I would be in the same way. But also, I appreciate everybody else's input on that too. Another idea is that God can show off to the angels what we're doing because we're choosing to do it in spite of our sin nature. We freely choose to do things for God instead of choosing to do sinful things for ourselves. And that's something that God can be proud of. Now, on the other hand, if you become too righteous, I start thinking about Job. Have you seen my servant Jeff? No, don't talk about Jeff. I mean, I don't want that kind of attention. Why, Jeff? Yes, I remember Jeff. Okay. So there again, thank you for your input. I'm not to hold on to wickedness and foolishness in the sense that I practice them, but I remember that until I'm in the presence of Jesus, I will have to deal with this body of flesh, and I have to continue applying myself and giving myself over to the Lord. In verse 19, we see that wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. So we see that wisdom has strength. Wisdom is highly desirable and can be very powerful. There again, how do we attain wisdom? The first step? Fear the Lord. Proverbs 1 verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where it starts. Which means if you don't start there, you're not going to get as much, if any at all. So that's where we start. We start there. I say that wisdom is to a wise man what a sniper rifle is to a sharpshooter. Okay? Now, wisdom, when you think of a wise person, typically you'll think about it occurs to them in their head. And sometimes it does, I suppose. I've heard. But more often than not, I mean, that does happen, but you hear things and you see things, you go, hey, that's a good idea, or that makes sense, or you find another application for it. That's wisdom. So wisdom is to a wise man what a tool is to an artisan. He is something that he uses that gives him great strength. And wisdom typically, although it can come in a burst with the Holy Spirit giving you wisdom, more often than not, wisdom, like righteousness, is a gradual process over which you're living, observing, and living and going on. In verse 20, it says, indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins. The question is complete righteousness attainable? Practical righteousness here on the earth? And the answer should be, Peggy, no. That's right, we can only get through Christ. So definitely not, and verse 20 says that. It just said, there's not a righteous man on the earth. Also in Romans it says, there is no one righteous, no, not one. And in Romans chapter 7, you see Paul, he's talking about his sin nature. Now, if anyone should attain practical righteousness, it's got to be Paul. But I struggle with this stuff in Romans chapter 7. The things I don't want to do, I wind up doing. I want to do this over here, and I can't do it. So he struggled with his sin nature until the very day that he entered into the presence of God. And then we see a common example in verse 21 to 22. It says, also, do not take seriously all the words which are spoken, so that you will not hear your servant cursing you. For you also have realized that you likewise have many times cursed others. And I think that this tags right onto the back of verse 20 in the sense of, by the way, if you think you're righteous, think about your speech. I thought about that this week. I go, man, I'm really wretched. And I try to be, but things come out of my mouth and I go, why did I say that? It's like another person spoke it through me, but it wasn't. It was me. And I think that's one of the easiest sins to commit is sin of speech. Bill? Driving? Oh, yes, yes. When I was there again in the fire department for a while, we were playing basketball as a shift. We'd get together and we'd do PT. That lasted about a year or two, and then there were so many injuries from basketball they had to cut the thing off. But because it's hard to believe that firefighters are kind of aggressive. Wham! Oh! We'd always say that basketball is the essence of life, because when you're hit in the side of the head, you don't have time to think, what would Jesus say? You're just saying whatever happened, okay? Just like that. And that's kind of what Bill's saying there. Something happens, whoa, that wasn't very good. Peggy. That's true. I love that. We judge others by their behavior, and we judge ourselves by our best intentions. Exactly. And I want justice for you, mercy for me. You know, isn't that right? That's the way we think, unfortunately. The things we say. Yeah. Let's read, I'm going to read 23 to 26 here. I tested all this with wisdom, and I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. What has been is remote and exceedingly mysterious. Who can discover it? I directed my mind to know, to investigate, and to seek wisdom and an explanation, and to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. And I discovered, more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is pleasing to God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her. Okay? Solomon is saying, I will understand this. He's doubling down is what he's doing. And you say, understand what? He says, all this. I'm going to understand this. So we saw this in the beginning. I applied myself. I threw myself into the mud, into the dirt. I wanted to find out what it was that made life worth living. Now he's kind of coming up short. I'm going to understand this. I'm going to push. I am going to understand. The first thing, you notice his determination. In verse 24, he studied the past. And he found out that the past is kind of mysterious. Especially back in those days, because back in those days, you didn't have nearly the books that we have today. I mean, we have thousands upon thousands of books that we can get about any particular topic at all. Back then, there weren't quite as many. And even so, can you get a complete understanding from books and the things that you read? And the answer is usually not. I mean, it is mysterious, and it's hard to understand sometimes. Now, Solomon, again, he's the wisest man in the world except for Jesus. Now, if he says, I'm having a hard time with it, we might expect we might have a challenging time as well, right? Because he is the wise person. So we study history, among other reasons, is to understand it and hopefully not repeat some of those mistakes. But sometimes it's hard. In verse 25, we see that Solomon directed his mind. He investigated. He sought wisdom. He sought explanations. He threw himself in the mud. And the result, back in same chapter, verse 23, it was far from me, but not for a lack of effort. He gave it his all, and he's still working on it. Okay? Now, there's one important finding in verse 26. How many of you, I'm sure all of you have seen episodes of I Love Lucy, right? So in one of the episodes years ago, Tennessee Ernie Ford is a relative of Lucy, I guess. And he's coming to visit the city. Now he's obviously country, he has the twang, etc. And so he's there visiting, and Lucy and Ricky are tired of him visiting. And they really would like him to go back home, but they can't figure out a way to make him go back home. Well, my mom always told me, watch out for those wicked city women. Aha. So Lucy does herself up as a wicked city woman, right? Turns out he likes wicked city women. Pretty soon, she's leaving. They're trying to get away from this guy, right? So, verse 26 says, I've discovered more bitter than death. Now, that's got to be bitter, right? More bitter than death? That's pretty bad. The woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. So, we have this woman that's being talked about. It says that her heart is full of snares and nets. Now, what are snares and nets used for? Typically. Right, to capture something, to trap an animal primarily, right? That's what it's used for. And then it talks about that her hands are chains. And what's the purpose of chains? Keep them close, right? So they don't go away. So they're captured and they're kept close. So maybe that's where the idea of the ball and chain comes from. I don't know. I'm treading on thin ice here. Now, this... Thankfully, I have a comfy couch. Now, this would be a difficult situation to be in, right? So this man is snared. This person is in chains. Go ahead, Aaron. Be nice, Aaron. Be nice. Good. Yes. Yes. So what Aaron is saying is that he's probably speaking from experience, because remember, he had 700 wives, 300 concubines. So he probably knows what it's like to be snared by a woman in that sense. And now there again, there's free will involved. Okay, so it's not like it's her fault per se, but he's talking about women have a real influence and can have an influence positively and also in this case negatively. In all seriousness, I have worked with men who have been married to people like this and who make their lives a living purgatory, seriously. And they almost seem to enjoy making life difficult for them to one degree or another, to exercise control. And there again, Solomon says that God will allow the righteous to escape and the sinner to be captured. Now here's a question for you out here too. How many of us as men were thoroughly acquainted with our wives before we married them? I know, what do I mean by thoroughly acquainted? I suppose after you've been married for a few weeks, you aren't still going, wow, that's new. I didn't expect that, you know? So I'm guessing from the lack of hands, yes, it's supposed to be rhetorical, so don't raise your hand. You know, no. I mean, I knew lots of things about my lovely wife, but my goodness, the first year, I didn't have sisters, you know. Oh my goodness, it was quite a learning curve for me. Linda says it's still a curve, still learning, you know, but yeah, you know, my prayer when I was in Bible college, and I really prayed this literally, I said, God, I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm looking for. Can you just please help me not to make a mistake? And I didn't, you know. I couldn't have a better wife, truly, in the world. So I'm so grateful for her. Now I might not have to sleep on the couch for the other thing I said, right? but seriously, so God gives us wives, and we need to be pleasing to Him because we want to get the right kind of wife. Verse 27, behold, I've discovered this, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find an explanation. So there again, he's still working. He's still putting stuff together. I want to figure this thing out, which I am still seeking. See, he hasn't stopped yet, but have not found. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. Behold, I have found this only, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices. Okay, so he's still looking, still working, but then he says this one statement, I have found one man among 1,000. Now, it doesn't say specifically what he means here. What do you mean, one man among 1,000? What distinguishes that one man from all the others? So contextually, translators have said probably righteous. I have found one righteous man among 1,000, probably, but not any women among them. So, what do you think about that? Oh, the time's up. Julie. Go ahead, Julie. Okay. True. Really? Okay. Okay. Because, like, I can take his name and give it to Aubrey, and she'll deal with him. Right. And that's kind of what Peggy alluded to about intentions versus how we perceive things. Speaking of which, more wisdom. Go ahead, Peggy. Yes. Yes. That's true. That's a good point. I've heard. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Good, good. Now, here's another idea. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Yeah. Good. Appreciate that input. So here's another thought that I was going to go for. This very well is hyperbole. Now let's face it. 1 out of 1,000 versus 0 out of 1,000. It's not a big. It's whoa. We're really coming out ahead. 1/10 of 1%. So I think it's almost hyperbole, because 1 out of 1,000 versus nothing out of 1,000. Go ahead, Taryn. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because really, how many righteous are there? None. Romans 3 says there is none righteous, no, not one. So there isn't one out of 1,000. There's none. We're all sinners in need of a Savior. Lou. Mm-hmm. Okay, whether his statement came out of frustration, yeah, I don't know. I definitely think it's hyperbole, but why? Perhaps. Linda, did you have your hand up? You sure? Okay. All right. Well, one more thing. It says in verse 29, I know I found only this. So this is his conclusion after all this so far. God made men upright, but they, meaning men, have sought out many devices. So in other words, God made us upright, and of course that's in Adam. And now where are we? We seek out many devices. We seek to do things our own way, and we commit sin. And that's pretty much what this is about. Any final thoughts? Any quick final thoughts? All right, so next week I'm going to be working on my retirement and do some gold mining. And Bill is going to, he's going to teach. I told Bill I'll come back when I get my 2-pound nugget, which should be somewhere in 2026. So at the rate I'm going. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. Lord, we thank you so much for this time. We thank you for your word. Your word is amazing. And it's so worthwhile, Lord, to dig and to sift and to pick out these things and all the things you have to teach us. Father, please help us to grasp wisdom and righteousness, but not in a self-righteous way or to puff ourselves up, but to be followers of you and to honor your name in what we think, say, and do, Father. Lord, please be with the worship team. May they play and sing skillfully and make that joyful noise, opening hearts to you. And Father, Pastor Jason, as he preaches your word, may we grow and mature in it. In Jesus' name, amen.